Secretary Blinken is really pushing for a different means of executing the next phase of the combat operations.
Israel has said this evening that 6 more hostages have been returned to its territory after being released from Gaza. 2 others were freed earlier today, French-Israeli Mia Shem, who was kidnapped from the Supernova Music Festival, and lawyer Amit Susana. 30 more Palestinian prisoners are due to be released from Israeli jails in return under an extended temporary ceasefire, which entered its 7th day. Earlier, a pair of gunmen killed 3 people at a Jerusalem bus stop at rush hour before being shot dead by police. The attack was claimed by Hamas.
So it certainly is a good thing anytime hostages are released, but I would agree with you. It looks like the negotiations are getting more and more difficult. One reason maybe is that Hamas doesn't really have control of a lot of these hostages, and they don't necessarily know where they are. So they're having to go and piecemeal them together because it's simply not easy for them to do. But hopefully they can keep doing it, because the more hostages that come out through a negotiated manner, the better. Because once this combat operations start again, everybody's going to have to be rescued by force, by military operation, and that is far less likely and far more risky to the hostages themselves.
What do you make of Secretary of State Blinken's mission today? He wants to extend the truce, of course, and get more hostages out and continue the delivery of aid. And he said, very importantly, the way Israel does this matters. He was talking about Israel prosecuting this war.
So I do think Secretary Blinken is really pushing for a different means of executing the next phase of the combat operations. The United States obviously supports Israel's objective in destroying Hamas, but I really think they thought that the way the shaping operation took place did not take in civilian casualties into account as much as they should. It was basically out of proportion to the military necessity. And I think people are seeing the devastation in northern Gaza and coming to that conclusion. So I think it's very clear, both publicly and probably privately, that that is what the United States does not want to see when this combat operation starts again.
I'm just going to quote him again, paraphrase, but he says, look, Israel has one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world. It's perfectly capable of neutralizing the enemy while minimizing civilian casualties. Why do you think that appears not to have been, I say appears, in most people's opinions, certainly outside Israel, it hasn't been prosecuted that way?
So I don't know the exact answer. I do think there was likely a bit of a desire to do everything they can to crush Hamas. Hamas is hiding in civilian populations. It's important to note that Israel pushed hard for civilians to leave northern Gaza so they wouldn't have this huge civilian population that they would have to deal with. They did, which is a good thing, and over 1 million left. It's important to point that out. But I think from what I've seen, and I have been in urban combat many times, that they simply were focused so much on Hamas, subterranean in the tunnels, that they didn't take into account all the devastation they would cause, in the buildings. So if they hit a tunnel and they collapsed 3 buildings, yes, the Hamas fighters were killed, but a lot of civilians were killed. So I think a lot of that is basically them focused like a laser beam on the threat, the terrorist organization that is Hamas. But I think the United States would like to see a lot more precision when it comes to the next phase of this operation.
But something like 80% of the population of Gaza, that's nearly 1.8 million people, are not living in their homes, and the majority of them have now been pushed into the south of the country. How does Israel guarantee their safety? Where do they go? What kind of protective areas do you think they'll be able to create? We keep hearing about these enclaves, but one wonders where they are. It's a tiny piece of land.
It is a very tiny piece of land, right? So it's only 25 miles long and 7 miles wide. It is important. There's several reasons there. Very good question. They need to have a safe zone that people know that's designated to be such, where they can get a completely uninterrupted supply of humanitarian assistance in. They're woefully low on food, water, medicine, power, and this winter is just getting worse. So that needs to happen. And to your point, over 1 million people are now unsheltered. So they need to have shelters set up. It needs to be monitored so Hamas doesn't do what they usually do, which is hide among the civilian population. But there should be a place where the civilians could go and get all that stuff and get out of the line of fire. It should be a safe zone with no military activity. Way easier said than done. But this is going to take more than just Israel. It's going to take the international community to do more than, sit on the sidelines and critique. They need to be in there helping set this up and ensuring that all this human devastation that's happening in Gaza is mitigated by a steady supply of all the humanitarian assistance that they need.
So far, Mick, something like 75 Israelis, including dual nationals, have been freed, and a number of foreign nationals. There's still around 125 Israeli men who are still held hostage by Hamas. One wonders how the negotiations will differ now.
So it's certainly different categories of people. Children, elderly, women that are non-combatants, they fall into another category. The next category, I think, is going to be once those individuals are released, hopefully, all of them. The next category will be older men, people that fall outside what we call the fighting age male, right? So they will be the next category. And then the last will be the fighting age males, and the very last will be the actual soldiers. They will be the last to be released based on everything that's happened so far. And that will be, hopefully they can all come out, they can all be released, because if they're not, then once this combat operation starts again, the recovery is going to be much more complicated and much more risky to the hostages.
And what of the Palestinians? Some 210 have been released by Israel into the West Bank. At the same time, there's escalating violence there and in East Jerusalem. How important is it for Blinken to say to Israel, this also matters? What you do in the West Bank, in Jenin, matters because, of course, every action triggers a reaction.
That's right. And I do believe Secretary Blinken addressed that directly. Everybody's responsible for their own actions, and that is important when it comes to violence against Palestinians or violence, as we saw today, against Israelis.
Yes.
Right. So that I think that's very important. Certainly, if Israel doesn't do everything they can to contain this, it is going to spread. And I think that's very important, something the United States certainly doesn't want to see, and wouldn't be good for the region, and certainly not good for Israel. So there's, I think, a very strong push, not only to address what's currently going on, but also to start talking about the way ahead. Whether it's right now in the need to set up humanitarian assistance, but also what is going to be the next phase when it comes to diplomacy and going back to a discussion on the two-state solution, which to many might seem way off in the future, but something I think that the Secretary is really trying to push, because if we don't want this to happen again, we need to start looking at ways to change that.
And that was Mick Mulroy, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, and he was the Pentagon's top policy official for the Middle East back in the day.